Come on. Oh, hi there. This is Rosanna from Woodfield So What Sessions once again. I was just really struggling to thread my needle there. It can be a bit of a tricky thing to do sometimes, which is why I'm going to go through it in this video. We already have our mounted hoop from before, so now we need to thread our needle so we can actually get started on making something. So I'm going to go through how to thread a needle using by eye as well as a needle threader, which can be a really handy little tool to use if you're struggling. So first, needles. Embroidery needles can sometimes be called crewel needles, and I don't mean cruel as in mean, crewel as in C-R-E-W-E-L. They have a sharp point and a nice sort of wider eye that you can see there, so we can put our thread through. But really it's, you know, finding the needle that works for you. The thicker the fabric you're working with, the thicker the needle you'll need. I also tend to use a smaller needle like that if I'm working with just one thread to do some of the more sort of like finer shading details in my work. But, you know, really it's about finding the needles that work for you. And on my sort of hectic pin cushion there, I've got the needles that I really like working with out of the sets that I have. So I'm going to use this one that I showed you to begin with as a nice sort of, so she's got a sharp point and a good eye for us to start threading. So in terms of thread itself, you might be familiar with sort of spools of thread like this used for sewing and sewing machines. You can embroider with this. To be honest with you, if you can get it through a needle and get it through the fabric, you can embroider with anything. I've seen embroidery done with hair, wire, even flowers. If you can thread it through the fabric, you can embroider with it. But to start with, we'll start with embroidery thread, and they look a little bit different. The most common embroidery thread in the UK at least come looking a bit like this, and these are called, they could be called floss, embroidery floss, or skeins or skein depending on your pronunciation, and that's spelt S-K-E-I-N. So they come in these little sort of skeins here where the thread is sort of, you know, doubled over and wrapped up, and with, it's got, you know, the thread loose there, so you can start pulling it through, or if you've got little sort of thread holders like I have, wrap it around one of those. I've seen people use lollipop sticks as well, which I think is quite cool. Recycle and reuse and all that. So that's what our embroidery thread looks like. I'm going to use black for this video because it's a nice contrast, it's a nice dark colour, and when I get on to showing you the threads and the stitches, sorry, it will be a really nice contrast against the pale calico fabric that we have. So you want to unravel some of your thread, and I was taught that you shouldn't cut any longer than your elbow. If you cut it too long, and this is the mistake a lot of people do, because they think, oh, the longer the thread, the less I'll have to change it, which is true, but the longer the thread, the more likely it is going to tie itself in knots. Even if it's a really silky thread, it can just tie itself in knots. So I was taught length of your elbow. You can see that the thread is actually in 6. Can you see that there? So it's actually 6 individual threads wrapped into one long one. I'm trying to show you that. Doesn't want to come apart. There we go. And that means that you can control the thickness of your work and your thread. I'm going to start with 3. I think that's a nice sort of middle ground, 3 and 3. That also means I have, once I separate, I have 2 lots of the same thread, so I don't have to cut another piece for a little while. And you can either just start pulling it apart like that. Silkier threads come apart a bit easier. Or if you're having trouble, you can sort of tease it out like this. That's another trick. You sort of hold it and pull it apart with your left hand or right hand if you're left-handed, and twizzle that way. I've also seen people, you know, you just hold on to the thread like that and you can pull it out. There we go. And you just smooth out the other side. We have our thread. So, to thread our needle, you can just do it by eye. This one works quite well. So I've just done it by eye there. Or you can use one of these nifty little things called a needle threader. That's better against my hair actually. It's got this little diamond, wire diamond on the top here. And that goes through the eye of the needle. And the needle sort of hangs on where the diamond sort of pinches together. So it goes through the eye of the needle. And then the thread goes through that diamond like that. Just pull that through so it hangs down. You can just, it should just hang there if you've done it right. And then you want to pull that diamond back through the eye of the needle like that. And it's done. Does all the work for you. These are really, really good and they're really cheap. You can get a pack of them for like a few quid, or they're like 20p each. They're great. And then just want to tie a double knot in the end of your thread because you don't want it to come through. There is ways of doing it without knotting, because sometimes you don't want knots on the back, especially if you're creating something like a patch, something like that. You don't want the knots. But for now, to start with, we're going to use knots. So here we are. Got our thread ready, our knot at the end, and we're ready to start. So in the next part of the video, I'm going to go through how to do a very basic running stitch, and also a back stitch, because the back stitch creates a really nice outline and I use it a lot in my work. So we're going to practice those to begin with. Okay, so we have our mounted hoop from last time, and now we also have our threaded needle ready to start. So we're going to begin with a simple running stitch, which is a forward stitch that has little gaps in, a bit like road markings. And then we're going to go on to back stitch, which I use a lot in my work to outline things. It's a very good stitch to outline areas with because it will create a continuous line. So whereas running stitch has little gaps in, back stitch will create a continuous line of thread and act as a really nice outline. So to do running stitch, it's very simple. You just want to come up anywhere, doesn't matter, we're just practicing. Then you just go down. I'm doing quite wide stitches for the purpose of showing you here. There we go. And again, if you can, get the distance between your threads equal. It takes a bit of practice, but it just looks a bit neater. And that's it. That's running stitch. Really simple like that. It creates these gaps here, but it's a really nice basic starting stitch to just get the hang of it. And then back stitch, I'm not going to cast off yet because I've still got quite a lot of thread, so I'll show you how to do that at the end. But back stitch starts like a running stitch, so you would come up and go forward like a running stitch, like that. The difference is now is that we loop back on ourselves. So we come up the same length away from our end point. That's where we come up with our needle, if you can see that there. It takes a bit of time to get this equal, but just try your best for now. So you come up that same distance away, and then you want to actually go in to the same hole as the previous stitch. So not, if you went a bit away like that, you're going to end up with a gap. So to make sure the threads all link up and create a nice solid outline, you want to go in the same hole as previous. And then there is absolutely no gap. And you just keep on like that. You loop back, you come up the same distance away, and you go back down in that same hole like that. And there we are, that is backstitch. No gaps, a nice equal distance of the thread, and it creates a really nice line, smooth line. So when you're done practicing that, we're going to cast off, which you do either when you're just finished for the day or you need to change thread because you have got to the end of your thread. So there's different ways of doing this, and there are actually ways of doing it where you don't need to create a knot. But for starters, I always recommend just tying a knot in your thread, because the last thing you want to do is work on something and then have it unravel or come loose or anything like that. So there are different ways of doing this. You can go under your threads at the back like that, and you then end up creating a little loop, and you can go through that, and that creates a little knot there. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, if you've got multiple threads that you're working with, and again we're working with 3 here, there's another way of doing it which is particularly handy if you haven't got a lot of thread left. I always recommend leaving, you know, a couple of inches to make sure that you've got enough to cast off, especially while you're practicing. But another way of doing it is to separate your thread. So we've got 3, so I'd separate it into 2 and 1. It's going to be a bit trickier as we've got quite a lot of thread here, so this tends to be the best method for when you've got a really little sort of tail left, because it can end up tying itself in knots. So I'm just going to unravel to make sure it doesn't do that. So there we go. You can see that I've separated those down to the end, and then you just tie it in a knot like you would, you know, a shoelace or something. Just tie it in a knot like that. I tend to do double just to make sure it doesn't unravel. Like that. And then just use our scissors to snip it off. And there we have it. We've got our running stitch and our back stitch.